Domination differs from rational exercise of authority. The latter, which is inherent in any societal division of labor, is derived from knowledge and confined to the administration of functions and arrangements necessary for the advancement of the whole. In contrast, domination exercised by a particular group or individual in order to sustain and enhance itself in a privileged position. He goes on to elaborate. So this idea of a kind of sort of artificially imposed scarcity is what makes this kind of surplus repression possible. Scarcity is no longer sort of a result of natural circumstances, but is something that is sort of artificially imposed upon people. As he says here, this argument, which looms large in Freud's metapsychology, is fallacious insofar as it applies to the brute fact of scarcity. What actually is a consequence of a specific organization of scarcity and of a specific existential attitude enforced by this organization. The prevalent scarcity has throughout civilization, although in very different modes, been organized in such a way that it has not been distributed collectively in accordance with individual needs, nor has the procurement of goods for the satisfaction of needs been organized with the objective of best satisfying the developing needs of the individuals. Instead, the distribution of scarcity, as well as the effort of overcoming it, the mode of work, have been imposed upon individuals first by mere violence, subsequently by a more rational utilization of power. And by a more rational utilization of power, basically, he's talking about the market. He's talking about capitalism, basically. So this idea of scarcity is a very sort of important idea. It's central both to Marcuse's argument. It's central really to Marx's argument too, for, in favor of socialism. So I think it's worthwhile maybe to explore this idea a little bit, because what scarcity means, excuse me, is that, basically it's a lack. It's a lack of resources. And because there's a lack of resources, we need to, develop a sort of exclusive means of distributing these resources. And, under the current day system, of course, it's through the mechanism of the price. If you can't afford to pay for the resource in question, then you can't have it. And those goods and resources are basically only allocated on that basis. But what if the scarcity doesn't really exist? What if there's such an abundance of goods and resources that there's more than enough available for everybody? Then that would make the price mechanism, the exclusiveness of price, unnecessary, basically. But of course, to keep the system going, to justify both the repression of the individual person, as well as the specific organization of society that he's talking about, you have to sort of keep this illusion going. So like I said, this is both important, this is both central to what Marcuse is talking about. This is also very central to what Marx is talking about. Of course, Marcuse being influenced by Marx. So is scarcity artificially imposed upon people? I think that's an important question to take up. And I provided a few examples here, I think, that would answer that. Yes, that it is in fact artificially imposed upon people, at least when it comes to sort of basic resources of life. First of all, actually, before I get into that, let me switch gears for a second, if I can. And it's important to keep in mind also, right, that most of these things like food, housing, things that we'll be talking about in a moment, right, these are already basically recognized as rights throughout most of the rest of the world, with the exception of the United States and a handful of other countries. So if you're not aware of this, this is something known as the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It's basically one part of what is known overall as the International Bill of Human Rights, which itself is composed of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and this other covenant which I just mentioned. Now, both these international covenants, as you can see here on this Wikipedia entry, both date from 1954. They were signed 1966, took effect in 1976. The United States signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1940, signed and ratified it in 1948, signed and ratified this other covenant, but has not officially ratified this covenant. As you can see here, it stands out. It was signed by Jimmy Carter in 1979, but was not taken before the Senate, right, for a treaty to become law, it has to be basically approved by the Senate as well. Carter never took it in front of the Senate, and basically it's sort of languished there ever since then. Republican presidents deny that these things are human rights. Again, food, housing, shelter, education, healthcare. Yeah, Kyle, do you have your hand up?
I was gonna say that it's not really a precedent. The U.S. used white phosphorus and Agent Orange and all these things. I mean, the U.S. doesn't follow international law. They never did.
No, it doesn't. But most other countries do. I mean, at least to some extent. At least regarding this area. And of course, most other countries aren't going around, bombing other countries and far off places. But it's worth pointing that out, right? I mean, most of these things are recognized as human rights throughout most of the rest of the world, except here in the United States. Republican presidents do not consider things like healthcare and housing and stuff like that a human right. Democratic administrations since Carter, Clinton and Obama, say they agree with the idea that these are human rights, but are simply unwilling to do anything about it. And have, are unwilling to make an issue out of this. Yeah, Kaim, you have your hand up again?
I don't think it's an unwillingness to do anything about it. I just think that they create false justifications on why we can't do it, because it's out of control.
Yeah, I mean, they probably don't, think it would get passed.
I think in the last class I said there's 10 million homes in the U.S. and there's only like 2 million homeless people or something. I don't know.
Yeah, well, we're actually gonna talk about that. Yeah. Not throughout the United States, but I took as an example housing in New York City, which I think is interesting. So let me switch over to that. So this is just kind of the background. So just keep that in mind. Most of the rest of the world, I mean, again, I'm emphasizing this map because it's extremely conspicuous, right? All these states in green have basically ratified this thing. The U.S. hasn't, and again, there's a handful of other states that have not ratified it. Saudi Arabia, South Sudan, a couple of other African states, Malaysia. But again, obviously most of the rest of the world has. So I'm going to switch back to another article in a second, but let me go back here. So again, artificial scarcity, does it actually exist? Now, again, scarcity exists, right? I mean, people do have, trouble accessing food and housing and things like that. The point is whether or not those things are actually related to some sort of natural circumstance, like there's just an actual lack of these things around, or if this scarcity is sort of artificially imposed upon people. So let's take food, for example. Now, according to this website, feedingamerica.org, how much food waste is there in the United States? Each year, 108 billion pounds of food is wasted in the United States. That equates to 130 billion meals and more than $408 billion in food thrown away each year. Shockingly, nearly 40% of all food in America is wasted. Now, this is a point that I've made before. There's plenty of people that go hungry in the United States or have, again, lack of access to proper nutrition and things like that. But it's not because there's not enough food to go around. It's just that these people don't have money to pay for the food. And of course, because we don't consider, food a basic human right, even though it's clearly essential to life. I mean, when you make something a right, basically what you're saying is that, people should have more or less free access to it. And instead, we treat these things as a commodity. And when you're talking about a commodity, you're talking about something that's exchanged on the market. And when you're talking about the market, you're basically talking about the profit motive. I'm just trying to explain that here. These concepts are basically related to each other. Exchange, market, the profit motive. Why do people exchange goods on the market? Because they're trying to make a profit. They're not trying to break even, and they're not doing it out of charity or anything like that. They're trying to make a profit. So when we make food a commodity that's produced for profit, we create a situation where, again, people are not going to have access to food. But again, not because there's not enough food to go around, but because they just don't have the means of paying for it. And again, we waste a tremendous amount of food. It doesn't say it here, but farmers are actually paid by the government not to grow food. in order to, stabilize the price of certain crops and things like that. So you can even produce more food than what is actually being produced. And again, even under the current system, billions of pounds of food, as it says here, are being wasted basically every year. Now, housing is another interesting example. I'll switch over to this article in a second, but yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, throughout the nation, you see the same problem going on. I read this article over the weekend, which I thought was kind of interesting, about apartments here in New York City. Apparently, there are tens of thousands of vacant apartments in New York City. The term that they use for this is warehousing, meaning that they're vacant, but they're not even being rented out. You don't even have the option of renting out these apartments. Landlords are simply holding on to these things because they don't want to rent them out for a lower rent. They're hoping that they can hold out more and maybe get a higher rent value, or find someone that's willing to pay a higher rent. Meanwhile, you have, again, like something, according to this article, 16,000, vacant apartments here in New York City. Now, this article is from 2020. It mentions, of course, that this is a pandemic high. It doesn't specify what it was like beforehand. I think it's safe to assume probably even, pre-pandemic, you still had thousands of empty apartments here in New York City. Lots of landlords complain about the housing regulations and things like that, which we'll get into in a moment. But again, I mean, this is a central part of Marx's argument, which is that, after a certain point, the profit motive actually becomes an impediment to productivity, and that the market creates waste. It creates, an inefficient means of allocating resources. That's a very important argument. I mean, this is very much, central to Marx's argument for socialism. And it's really an effective argument against people who defend the capitalist system, because, of course, what do they always point out to? They always say, well, look what capitalism did. Capitalism created all this productivity growth, starting from the 1800s and whatever else. So how can you possibly criticize it? Well, Marx anticipates that kind of argument, or is able to respond to that kind of argument. And basically what he seems to be saying in simple terms is that it almost kind of follows like a two-stage process. In the early stage of the development of capitalism, the unleashing of the profit motive, the unleashing of productive forces, there's an enormous amount of growth early on. But what happens is that as you sort of move into the second phase of development, the profit motive actually then becomes sort of an impediment. It actually sort of hinders productivity, and it sort of makes it harder, again, to allocate resources to people who actually need it. I mean, if you want to think of it, in terms of like a metaphor, it's almost like being on like a sugar rush or something like that, or maybe being, high on cocaine or something like that. Whereas in the first phase, there's the sort of, bustling of activity and restlessness and all this, energy and stuff like that. But then what happens after that? Then you reach the second phase. You reach the sort of come down phase, where now things start to fall apart and things, get kind of, like messy from that point on. In a certain sense, that seems to be the kind of argument that Marx and, Marcuse following Marx is making about capitalism. That after a certain point, the profit motive, again, starts to impede productivity. And it's sort of an irrational way of allocating resources. Where, of course, defenders of the system always point to the fact that it's rational. Just simply let the market, work itself out, and always lead to the best possible outcomes. And of course, I think the best way to counter that argument is to show all the wastefulness, all the sort of ways in which the market doesn't produce an effective outcome. So we've talked about the wasting of food. We'll talk about housing. And because I'll get into housing a little bit more, let me just quickly mention the other two aspects of it. Many factories, for example, like I remember reading about this with like the U.S. steel industry, and as lots of factory jobs get outsourced and things like that. Many factories operate at far less than their full capacity. Many operate at like 50% capacity, or even less, 25% capacity. And again, it's because of the profit motive. It's because, much like the farmers who get subsidies for the government, it's about stabilizing prices. But in the name of stabilizing prices, and again, in name of preserving the profit motive, you lead to something which actually, again, impedes productivity. We could actually be producing more stuff. Not that, producing, heavy industry is always a good thing, but you could also, factor that into other things like fossil fuels and things like that. Why do the American economy and economies throughout the world, why do we continue to be addicted to oil? Which is now we're seeing, with this, massive inflation in the price of gas and things like that, because fossil fuels are profitable, and people make enormous amounts of money, and they're also, by the way, able to use their profits to, lobby the government to get laws passed that benefit them. If not for that, if not for the insane profitability of fossil fuels, we probably already would have moved on to things a long time ago. So, like I said, I mean, this is very much an important argument. Yeah, Kai, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say this before because like we were talking about scarcity, and like that's what a lot of these conservatives think is like the earth has like unlimited resources. Because a lot of them don't even think the earth is a globe. But anyways,
well, a lot of them don't think that climate change is a real thing. They
yeah,
think
because that they think that the earth has infinite resources because they believe in the Bible, literally.
right.
And there's nothing wrong with believing in the Bible. It's just that they just take it to an extreme.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've already said, I mean, I think, these people are probably, they're, like death instinct has basically, taken over them, essentially. I mean, given their attitudes on climate change, given their attitudes on COVID, their attitudes towards, guns, the death penalty. I mean, these are people that have deep-seated destructive impulses, I think. And the earth does not have infinite resources, but again, we have more than enough, more than enough capability to produce enough food, for example, to feed everybody. I mean, that certainly does happen to be true, and that's an important thing because, again, I mean, if there's all this food, if 40% of food, produced just in this country gets wasted, well, why not just give it out to people for free? I mean, I mean, because you make people pay for it, you end up wasting this enormous amount. So pointing out the, how the profit motive actually impedes or limits productivity, how it creates waste and things like that. These are effective arguments to make against people who, constantly defend the rationality of the market. Yeah, Kayam.
Yeah, you made me think of another thing. It's funny because like I feel like we all learned that like like these companies like Gucci and stuff, they like burn their clothes, but then like
Right.
we don't bring it down to like our level of like food production.
Yeah, I mean, again, I mean, it's just it creates an enormous amount of waste. So it's not, linking everything to the market. And again, when you're talking about the market, you're talking about the profit motive. It's just not an efficient way to organize the economy. It Marx would concede, of course, that yes, in the early phase of development, it does create lots of productivity, but you start to get to a tipping point where that's no longer the case. And I feel like most people who defend the market, they always make these kind of quasi historical arguments where they say, well, look at all the economic growth since 1800. It's like, well, yeah, since 1800, but actually, even if you just look at the last, like 50 years or so, or 30 years in the United States, the economy hasn't grown that much. And again, economic growth is not just, the end all be all of everything. But when you consider, again, the sort of artificially imposed, scarcity that people have to deal with, especially for things like food and housing. And let me turn into talking about this article about housing, because I think that's interesting too. But I think it is an effective argument. And again, it's one of the most important arguments that Marx makes in favor of socialism, that under a socialist system where you didn't have everything subordinated to the profit motive, you wouldn't have these limitations on things, and you wouldn't have this, enormous wastefulness that currently obtains under the current system. And just the other fact of the matter that it's just, most people, whether you're a Marxist or not, I think, or socialist or not, would hold it to be wrong. These things should be treated as for-profit industries. I mean, these things are things, healthcare, housing, food. These are things that should be considered basic human rights, and of course are considered basic human rights in most other parts of the world. And not to say that those other countries always sort of follow through on things, but at least they acknowledge that, at least to a greater extent than people do here in the United States. And again, just to link up these concepts again, when you're talking about commodities, you're talking about something that's produced for exchange on the market in order to make a profit. Now, Marx would also say, of course, that in the early on, when commodities are produced, they have a use value. They have an actual utility for people. But that utility, that usefulness, is always secondary to its exchange value. And again, when you hear exchange value, think basically profitability. And and of course that makes sense, right? Because early on, like, why would people buy anything anyway if it doesn't have a kind of use for it? But what happens is that over time, these things kind of move further and further apart, and the use value becomes more and more sort of buried under the dominance of exchange value. So the actual utility of things, the actual usefulness of things, takes more and more of a secondary role towards the profitability of things, to the point where you have things now like NFTs, which basically have no use value. And I think that's part of the reason why people focus on these things a lot, and why it's become such a controversial thing. We have now reached a point, and I'm not sure if NFTs are literally like the first example of this in human history, but they're certainly a good example of this. Of a commodity that basically has literally no use value. It's just all pure exchange value at this point. It's all basically just based upon what people hope to, again, realize as a profit in the market, basically by, fooling other, gullible people who are willing to pay, enormous amounts of money for these things. And of course, that's another example of how irrational the market becomes. I mean, we're now producing like completely like useless crap, which also apparently also takes a tremendous toll on the environment as well. All the computing resources and things like that go along with that. So again, I'm stressing this or emphasizing this because this is very, very much central to Marcuse's argument, right? This idea of surplus repression, that if you eliminate scarcity, or if you realize that scarcity is artificially imposed, it kind of undermines the whole notion of repression, right? People wouldn't have to repress themselves as much in order to obtain, things which, again, should probably be considered basic human needs anyway. But let's look at this article on housing, because I thought it was fairly interesting. Kind of caught my attention reading it over the weekend. So this is from 2020. Excuse me, my voice is not good today. Again, New York must act to stop warehousing of vacant affordable apartments. And I won't go through the whole thing, obviously, but I'll try to pick out some of the the highlights here, if you will. So they talk about this woman who's been living in a same apartment in Bushwick for 40 years or something like that. Some of the vacant apartments around her are falling into disrepair. They always start these articles with a specific story to really get you sort of like, into the the human element of it, so to speak. But I'm actually, and that's unfortunate, of course. I'm sure these things happen all the time. But there were some, data that's pointed out here that I thought was interesting. So they mentioned about 92,000 homeless people here in New York City. Actually, one of the commenters to this article indicates that number is probably actually more so than what they're saying. Probably well over 100,000 people. That's a lot of people, obviously. So again, due to COVID, one of the biggest vacancy rates in years. This is a link to a CNN article. I'm not going to click on it. I did include the link to the article in this PowerPoint if you want to look at it when I upload the PowerPoint. It mentioned somewhere about 16,000 apartments available to rent. Many of them being these are vacant apartments. These are apartments that where no one is living in, and apparently are not even being rented out. Landlords are just sort of holding on to them, what we would call basically hoarding, but they use this term, basically warehousing them. They're just holding on to them. They're not renting them out. They don't want to accept a lower rent. And so they talk about some of the solutions for it. which I won't get into too much. I mean, they talk about, taxing, vacant apartments, having more, government oversight of these things. So an interesting thing, I couldn't help but look at some of the comments, and I kind of got sort of sucked into the rabbit hole of this, and maybe you'll see why. Maybe I'll strike a similar chord with you, because what you have here are some people who obviously sort of agree with the idea. Oh, and I didn't mention, of course, the other aspect of it, of course, is that rent is just too high. Besides the fact that you have 100,000 homeless people, you have people facing extremely high rents who are barely able to make ends meet. And of course, part of that sort of inflation of the value of rent is driven by the fact that there are so many the supply of housing is essentially being restricted by people holding onto these things. If that supply was freed up, then obviously, there would be more housing available, which generally speaking, brings down the costs of things a little bit. But that's, of course, still assuming that housing is treated as a market. Right? Whereas if housing is a basic human right, then housing should not be treated as a market. There should not be a market for housing. Housing should not be a for-profit industry, just as much as healthcare should not be a for-profit industry. But let's look at some of the comments, because again, some of these people who are landlords apparently weigh in on this thing, and it's kind of interesting to see their take on this. So the first guy, takes a negative approach to this. You see people referencing this again and again, this idea that any kind of housing regulations are unconstitutional. Well, again, as again, one of the other comments he points out later on, I'm not going to go through every comment either, but if it was unconstitutional, then why haven't landlords brought this before a court? I mean, courts generally tend to be fairly, pro-business, pro-property owners. So if it was unconstitutional, they should have filed a lawsuit, taken it before a judge, and the judge would have ruled it to be unconstitutional. But of course, they haven't. But time and time again, you see these people, making these kinds of claims. It's unconstitutional to have, what we call rent stabilization, which is that, landlords have to keep rents at certain levels and things like that, and certain restrictions on the amount of rent. I mean, look, New York housing regulations are a complicated thing. I don't plan on, explaining every single aspect of it, but it does, I think, speak to this idea that, again, the supply of housing, that there's much more housing available, yet we're constantly hearing about a housing shortage. Well, in fact, that's just another form of artificial scarcity, basically. But all right, here's where it starts to get a little more interesting. So this other lady chimes in. She says this is pure tenant propaganda, which I think is funny. All those damn tenants, those people who can't afford housing. They can't afford a house of their own, but they have this very, very slick propaganda machine going. Apparently, it's pumping out all this anti-landlord propaganda. And again, they mostly say the same things. None of these people acknowledge, of course, that housing should be considered a human right. That they all defend their right to basically make a profit off of these things. Again, I'm not going to go through all this, but there are a lot of comments like that. I'm trying to think if there's anything else this lady says that is so she basically blames it on rich tenants. So sort of trying to don't be mad at the landlords, sort of like divide and conquer. This group of tenants should be mad at the other group of tenants and things like that. A bunch of people call her out for being, full of hot air. This lady's quite upset. She says all New York City apartments are very old. They're falling apart, infested with pets. The walls are moldy, the pipes, blah, blah, blah. Okay, you can see this lady's very upset about it. The next guy chimes in, another probably landlord. He says, Rochelle, you obvious do not know what it's like to run a building, blah, blah, blah. This guy goes on for a while. Now, look, I don't want to make fun of this guy. I mean, I don't know if he speaks English as a second language or something like that. But these are pretty, poorly written sentences. And I say that, I know it's like very anal to point out people's like grammar and things like that. But the guy, if you read this comment, has a very arrogant tone throughout this article. He says, history lesson aside. Oh yeah. So again, that housing, that rent stabilization, things like that are unconstitutional. They're forced against the constitutional rights of the landlord to have, regulations basically on how much they can charge for rent. Not again, no talk at all about how housing itself should be considered a human right. And again, in all fairness, it's not, right? Housing is not considered a human right here in the United States. Alexandria says, for this issue, I recommend this book called Evicted by Matthew Desmond. I had to read it for a sociology class, and it follows landlords and tenants, then proposes solutions for housing, vouchers, and other support. Okay, that's interesting. I'm not familiar with that book, but sounds like something worth checking out. So, this guy, as you can see, goes on for a long while. I mean, if I'll say anything in their favor, yeah, I mean, there's probably a lot more to this than just the greed and frankly the callousness of these landlords, which I think is on display in these comments. But yeah, there are other things, taxes, the way the city government is set up. I'm sure there's more to it than just that. But after reading these things, after reading some of these comments by some of these landlords, I'm glad that there are regulations, because these people sound incredibly callous, incredibly selfish. And the last thing that you would want to do is just, allow these people to just do whatever they want without any restrictions on them, which I mean, I'm sure is not their intention, but reading what they wrote, I mean, that certainly is the impression that I got. And then of course, you're taking a look at your own unfortunate situation because you can't catch the lucky break you think you deserve. You deserve by having a government handout. Again, there's certain parts where the guy says things that it's like kind of hard to follow what he's saying. And then he ends by saying, unless you walk a mile in someone's shoes, don't assume, what's going on. So again, don't feel sorry for the tenants. Don't feel sorry for the people living in, rat infested apartments and things like that. Feel sorry for the landlords. That's essentially what he's saying. By the way, narcissism, another very, sort of important Freudian, concept. And I think you see a little bit of that on display here as well. I mean, this is almost like a textbook example of narcissism. Don't have empathy for other people, or, I'm not going to have empathy for you, but you should have empathy for me, basically. You should feel sorry for me, but, basically, I don't give a shit about you. Is basically what he's saying, and he's telling you, you're not an environmental engineer, so don't say that the surfaces are moldy and things like that. I'm sure he would say, well, you're not an exterminator, so don't say that the apartment's infested and things like that. Now, this is written in 2020, as I've already pointed out. I wonder how these people would react to or what their take would be on the recent fire that was in the Bronx, right? The worst fire in the city in decades, basically. Which, of course, the mayor of New York City basically blamed on the tenants, basically saying, oh, they got to close the doors and stuff. Even though it came out that the doors were meant to automatically close, but they malfunctioned because of the lack of upkeep in these buildings. The building also didn't have a sprinkler system either, which apparently is legal under New York's housing law. You don't need to have sprinkler systems in your building, apparently, if you have some other substitute, which obviously didn't work. I'm sure these people would probably say the same thing. This guy writes, dude, New York City is a terrible place. Rents here are a scam, and for what? I don't understand that. You get here and get trapped by the rich, the poor become zombies. If you make less than $75,000 a year, your life here probably sucks. I don't understand how this apartment is at $2,000, 300 square feet when it's worth $500. This is a bigger issue. This is blah, blah, blah. And person writes, wow, that's just pure hatred. What's hateful about that comment? I don't really see that it's being hateful. Is it because he says the poor become like zombies? I mean, I don't think he's saying it against the poor people. I think he's just saying that the conditions in which they live under, basically, essentially suck the life out of it. But what else? I mean, what is this guy saying that's so hateful? If you make less than $75,000 a year, your life probably sucks. That sounds about accurate to me. $75,000 a year. I would say that's the bare minimum. I mean, I don't even live in New York City. I live in New Jersey, although I live very close to New York City. And most people living, at least in northern New Jersey, are affected by this as well because of your proximity to the city. Property values and things like that are very high here as well. And I know people who make about $75,000 a year, and they have a very difficult time just getting by living in New Jersey. So I'm sure it's probably just as hard, if not harder, living in New York City. Just for reference here, we're saying $2,000, $500. I think he's underplaying that to a certain extent. My parents used to live in New York City when I was born, actually, and they They used to live on 19th Street and 2nd Avenue, and they paid, I'm not that old. This is like I'm kind of old, but I'm not that old. We're talking like 1980s here. I mean, that apartment used to go for $400 a month, they said. That same building now goes for, and this was pre-COVID, but the last time I checked, what was going for like $3,000 a month. Same space, not a particularly big apartment or anything like that. Nothing much has changed, really. I mean, just that enormous inflation of value is just crazy. And of course, something should be done about that. This lady chimes in. I'm not going to spend too much more time on this. I'm going to move on, but there's at least one more comment that's kind of interesting. This lady says Democrats don't care whether something is constitutional or not. Again, a lot of people, of course, agree that rents are too high, that landlords are greedy. This guy says, again, there's more than 92,000 homeless people. He puts it at about 150,000 homeless, 100,000 more at risk of being homeless. He says he's a retired social worker. This person says they have 47 empty apartments in their building out of 120 units. That's, more than a third basically of their building is empty. This lady chimes in again saying the same thing. But here's one other guy, and this will be the last guy I talk about because I want to move on from this. This guy, Voltaire 42. Voltaire, one of the Enlightenment thinkers. So this is kind of a callback to dialectic of enlightenment, right? Which is that the argument of Horkheimer and Adorno is that the Enlightenment basically replaces one system of social domination with another system of social domination. So perhaps this guy is revealing more about himself than he intends to. Obviously, he's just going for I'm smart. Basically, he might as well call himself smart guy. 42 or whatever his name is. But this guy, I think, really takes the cake as far as ridiculousness goes. So he's saying this is completely justifiable, meaning that it's justifiable for landlords to hold on to these apartments, not rent them out. As a landlord with rent stabilized apartments, so more than one. So again, these people, if these people, and the other guy above also talks about how he's a business owner and he doesn't like paying his employees or something like that. So these people are crying the blues, acting like you should feel sorry for them. They all own multiple properties and businesses in New York City. I think it's fairly safe to assume that they're doing pretty well. And really, I mean, your mileage may vary, but in my opinion, they kind of come off as babies. These are people who are getting probably like 90% of things are going their way, but they still cry about it anyway because it's not 100%. They want everything to go their way, and they resent even the smallest amount of restrictions on anything that they can do. But he goes so far as to call it socialism, and of course, this is why what interested me here about it. He talks about New York City states, housing policies as basically being socialism. And again, it also refers to it as being unconstitutional, where someone else calls them out on, if it's unconstitutional, then why not, go before the courts. I like what he says here. I'll go back to the socialism thing in a second, but I like what he says here too. Harassment cases would evaporate overnight, as there would be zero motivation for landlords to harass a tenant, in as much as if the owner wanted to recover the unit, they could simply wait until the lease expires. So basically, he's saying that if only we could throw people out on the street when we want to, or when the lease expires, which is typically a year, then we wouldn't have to harass people anymore. We only have to harass people because we're not allowed to do to basically do whatever that we want to do. Essentially, what he's saying. But anyway, going back to this idea of socialism, I mean, this is how clueless these people are. If this was socialism, you wouldn't have housing you wouldn't have a housing market. That's the whole point of socialism is that things that, that you take things out of the marketplace. The things aren't not run as a for-profit business. So he says, if the state would let me earn a reasonable rate, that's fine, but I'm not going to do that. Where else does he talk about providing a service? He says something like, I'm providing a service to people. Maybe that he has another comment too. Maybe it's in the second comment. Well, what service are these people performing? They just cash checks every month. Any upkeep that they have to do is usually state regulated, which I'm sure they're also opposed to. Here's an interesting thing that most people don't know about. Adam Smith, who's sort of like the patron saint of capitalism, right? The classical economist the guy who wrote about the invisible hand of the marketplace and things like that, which, most people sort of use that phrase to talk about the market. The idea that just, again, just let the market work itself out, and things will, lead to the best possible outcome. Adam Smith was an advocate of industry. Adam Smith was an advocate of production and manufacturing. Adam Smith thought that landlords and, for that matter, financiers, people who live off of interest and debt and things like that, were basically parasites. Were basically people who were sort of siphoning resources away from production, from industry, basically, and actually favored high taxes on these unproductive forms of economic activity, what he called economic rent. So rent, we think of landlords, but for him, economic rent was basically, anything that sort of inflated the price of something above its actual value. And he believed that both landlords and bankers basically did that to a large extent. So kind of an inconvenient truth for a lot of these people who like to invoke Adam Smith. There are not a lot of things that Adam Smith and Karl Marx agreed on. Karl Marx, of course, being very much influenced by Adam Smith, right? That's how Marx is able to make this transition from being a German philosopher reading Hegel to talking about capitalism and things like that. It was largely through his reading of Smith and several other of the so-called classical economists that enabled him to do that. But they didn't agree on a lot of things. Of course, Marx goes in a much different direction than the classical economists do. But they did at least basically agree on the idea that landlords should basically be taxed out of existence, that they were essentially a hindrance to the economy. So again, very much an inconvenient truth, I think, for a lot of these people to digest. But anyway, going back to this idea of socialism, yeah, I mean, if you actually had socialism, you wouldn't have a housing market in the first place. You wouldn't have a class of landlords, that exist among these people. I mean, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And again, and that's why I say that they sound like they're just like entitled babies, because they get like 90% of things their way, but they're just mad because there's like the slightest amount of restriction upon them. And so, again, this is not a public policy class. I mean, I'm not, pretending to go through all the ins and outs. I'm sure New York housing regulations are very complex, but suffice to say, I think it at least proves the point that there is, of course, a housing shortage, in the fact that people have a hard time finding a house, or people especially have a hard time finding an affordable housing. But a lot of that is due to the fact that there is a restriction on the supply of housing because of this, class of landlords, basically, who are trying to, extract as much profit as they can out of it. Now, he also, of course, makes the unconvincing argument that, if we were just eliminate all restrictions on landlords, that rents would actually go down, which I think is fairly, a dubious claim to make. But that's not, if that's your goal, if you want to lower rents, and again, this is still presuming that there's a housing market, but if you want to lower rents within the housing market, there's more than one way to do that, right? You could possibly eliminate all restrictions on landlords and hope basically that they lower rents, which is, I would say assuming a lot. Or, that's like option A, basically. Or option B, basically, you could just eliminate the parasitic class of landlords, free up the housing, which they're hoarding away, basically. And that would also basically lower rents. So, which option do you want here? I'll leave it up to you to decide, of course. I think you know which one I would choose. But anyway, so yeah, and it goes on. But like I said, I think that pretty much proves the point. I'm not explaining everything about New York City housing, but the scarcity, the lack of housing, again, the lack of affordable housing as well, is artificially created. It's not because there's just not enough housing units going around. There are plenty of vacant homes. There are plenty of vacant apartments, things like that. Not just in New York City, of course, but throughout the country as a whole. But it's because these things are sort of held, sort of confined by the rules of the marketplace, and because they're run basically as a for-profit industry, that it basically, artificially restricts the supply of housing, which would be much more accessible other than that. And again, I already talked about factories working at less than full capacity to stabilize prices. We have a lot of make work jobs as well, and that's a little bit different, but kind of related to this. And this is something else that Marcuse talks about, right? Marcuse is a big proponent of automation, and sort of getting rid of unnecessary jobs, which is basically what make work means, is that because we force people to have to, sort of prove their economic value in the workplace, we have to preserve a certain amount of useless jobs, basically jobs that could clearly be gotten rid of at no cost to anyone else, and in fact would probably make things more efficient. But we preserve these things because we insist that people have some means of employment, that people have to, again, obtain a wage and then use that wage to obtain the other, necessities of life, basically. And there are lots of jobs. So Habermas, I'm sorry. Marcuse talks about, again, lots of industrial jobs could be automated. That's probably true. And that's one area where I would, have to agree. I think he's way too pessimistic on working class people in general, but this is one area where I think he probably is right. And people have to have a little bit more of a bigger imagination here and realize that you could probably live in a better society and get rid of these jobs, and then everyone would probably be better off. Not all of them, of course. Obviously, workers oppose automation because it means they're going to be thrown out of the job, and if they're thrown out of the job, then they're not going to have the means to support themselves. But if their ability to support themselves didn't depend on them having a job and obtaining a wage, then it wouldn't be such a big issue. So that's what I mean about, maybe having a little bit of a bigger imagination here. But there are other aspects of it as well. Many people talk about, the TSA, airport security, and things like that. They call it security theater. That doesn't really do anything. These are just ways of just employing people. So you don't have this massive surplus of unemployed people running around. But these jobs aren't really necessary. I mean, most of the rituals that, the complex rituals that people go through airport security don't really do anything to make people actually, much more safe on airplanes. Or how about the military, for example? That's another good example. And this is not to diminish the role of the American empire and the devastation that it inflicts upon other people. But a big part of the military is essentially just a means of employment. It's basically, giving people jobs who otherwise wouldn't have them. And again, you'd have this massive amount of people unemployed. That's probably a big part of the reason why every time the defense budget comes up every year, Congress usually ends up passing a bigger military budget than even what the president is asking for. And when the president makes his budget request every year, he does so, of course, in consultation with the the cabinet departments, including, of course, the Department of Defense. So why is it the Congress gives a bigger budget than what the president and even the Pentagon want? It's because a lot of these bases, of course, there are bases throughout the states of the Union, and these are jobs programs. These are ways of employing people. And the members of Congress worry what would happen if a lot of these bases closed up, and then you would have all these people unemployed. So there are a lot of unnecessary jobs, but they're unnecessary jobs, again, because we insist that people are sort of tied to employment, basically as a means of justifying your life. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And that's what people say. We always talk about the right to life, but in a sense, nobody has the right to life. If you have to essentially earn your living, then you don't have a right to life. Then your life is conditional on your economic productivity. You have to essentially prove that you're a productive worker in some way, in some capacity, to have a life. Otherwise, you're gonna die, basically. Well, what kind of right to life is that? And that's what he calls the performance principle. Again, tying this to economic productivity. He does that because he wants to separate the idea of the reality principle, right? I mean, he agrees with the idea that, yes, the pleasure principle becomes modified into the reality principle. People learn to repress some aspects of themselves. But what he has in mind, obviously, is an idea of the reality principle, reality principle, which is not as repressive as what we currently have. And what we currently have is what he again terms the performance principle. And I guess that'll pretty much wrap things up. Again, I missed out on a lot of class. After that, I was going to get into the second part of the book. After this, beyond the reality principle, or beyond the performance principle, which basically takes us up to the second half of the book, which is more or less where we'd be at now. But I guess we're running out of time. So any questions for me about anything? Someone asked, Adrian asked, we'll be going over it on Thursday. Moving on to the next topic. Thursday, yeah, we'll still talk about this a little bit more. We'll also talk about another essay by Erich Fromm, who's another member of the Frankfurt School, who was very much influenced by Freud, who actually is very critical of Marcuse to a certain extent. And Fromm is interesting in that Fromm actually was a practicing psychiatrist, unlike Marcuse, who's taking much more of a kind of philosophical take on Freud, let's say. So we'll sort of finish up with Marcuse and sort of address that a little bit. And that's pretty much it. I'll also talk a little bit more about the paper. I didn't get a chance to do that today either. But all right, if there's nothing else, then I guess I can let you go. All right, so take care, everyone. You too. Have a great day.